A lot of it's very technical, so I'm just going to go through the broad strokes about it, but this is straight from what you'll see the committee talk about as its guiding principles as we go through and work on climate change issues on the subcommittee on environment and climate change. Principle 1 is to set science-based targets to achieve GHG neutrality for mid-century. And the idea is that Congress has to enact policies that set certain enforceable targets to put the United States on a path towards zero net emissions no later than mid-century. And we know we have to act aggressively starting today. I would be remiss if I didn't mention right off the bat the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report that said we'll reach a tipping point in 12 years. I know so many of you have read about that, a tipping point in 12 years from this past year. And it was a major coup for the EPA's scientists to release that while we're still, we have an administration that is trying to pull back some of these issues. So one is science-based targets, and that means continuing to remain in the Paris Climate Accord. For those who have been following it already very closely, even though there was an attempt to get us out of the Paris Climate Accord, we're actually still in it for the next 2 years. And so some of what we're doing to work on in the committee that I made suggestions for is that we have oversight hearings on our compliance with it. And a lot of the both the utilities and major auto manufacturers and others are already complying with this stuff because they know the writing's on the wall no matter what. So the second principle would be develop new American jobs, industries, and prosperity. Congress must ensure emerging clean energy industries provide fair wages and safe working conditions, while also striving to protect America's energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries from anti-competitive behavior by nations that have not taken significant steps either to combat climate change or enforce meaningful labor and environmental standards. So you'll see whether we're pursuing oversight over the federal climate action plan that we have already in place, to making sure that as we see industries that will absolutely we'll see being displaced, particularly in Appalachia and other areas where coal country is now winding down, that we need to make sure that we're bringing these clean energy jobs to some of those areas. The third principle is invest in America's future while reducing climate pollution. And we'll be requiring congressional support for advancements in technology, policy, and finance to ease transition and lower costs of economy-wide decarbonization. And so we'll be working to make sure that we have our federal government and our industries have the money to be able to convert over to clean and renewable electricity resources. A fourth principle is deliver an equitable transition for all. Low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous peoples are expected to experience disproportionate harm from climate change. So we want to make sure that whether it is making sure we have utilities that not only communities of color, but communities with economic disadvantaged abilities are able to still be able to afford their power during that time. And again, going back to this point of making sure industries that are dying off in the old carbon-based economy are going to be helped in this new green economy. One of the other principles is to protect low-income households. Some of this there's overlap over. Another is to improve the resilience of communities and adapt to new climate reality. Every department, every level of government must consider best practices to manage and minimize the risk posed to climate change when making infrastructure investments. You'll see this as part of the $1 trillion infrastructure package that we're hopeful will pass through Congress and may actually have common ground, is that we'll be weaving in green technology and efforts to mitigate climate change and help with recycling and water protection through our actual infrastructure package. Another one is empower state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Another is to avoid harm to first movers. We're not trying to penalize those who are in the forefront already of helping out, and by helping out those those who've been slow to enact these issues, and finally create policy predictability and stability. I know that's a lot of sort of policy gobbledygook, but that's where we begin with some of the principles that the Congress has put forward. But we know we have to address climate change in an aggressive way. So a few of our strategies will be, one, to hold the United States government accountable to the Paris Climate Accord, because we're still in it right now. Two, we're still in the Clean Power Plan, which set 21st century goals for our utilities. Because in that instance, the Trump administration actually botched their repeal of it, and so the court struck down that repeal. And so these are both still the law. And one of the powers that the new Congress has is with oversight, with enforcing what is already in the law. So when you talk about all these things, whether it's lowering emissions, whether it's increasing renewables, whether it is going to carbon zero, whether it is increasing efficiencies, these paths have already been laid out in these two major agreements, the Paris Climate Accord and the Clean Power Plan. And so we've been given huge tools that we can ensure compliance with as the biggest strategies. And of course, there's a lot of bills that address those things, everything from appliance efficiency to the idea of getting total renewability by 2035. There's been some push on whether it's 2035 or 2050, but I think as long as we're pushing towards it aggressively, if we can get there even quicker, obviously that would be ideal. And a lot of you have been following the Green New Deal. I know David and I were just talking about that. Obviously I support the goals of it. There was some push at first of whether energy and commerce goals and policy rating powers would go to the select committee. That was the only part that I wasn't as much in agreement with, because I think we stick with that committee, and the other one is a fact-finding committee, and that's been worked out. But the rest, getting there by 2035, and all these other ideas of taking massive federal funding in the form of infrastructure and setting aggressive goals to address climate change now are all things that I know that not only I agree with, but all the new members of the Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as our Chairman Pallone, agree with, and definitely our Chairperson, Paul Tonko, of the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee. The one thing I want to take an opportunity to say is I invite you all to come up for one of these committee meetings. This is your government, this is your nation, this is your capital, and it's going to be more exciting now than the last term, where I sat through Natural Resources Committee hearings that were entitled "Coal, the Energy of the Future," climate change, hoax, or China conspiracy, and those aren't fun. And while I would have encouraged you to come up anyway to suffer through it, and by the way, I'm exaggerating on those titles, but that's what I feel like. But now we're going to really be able to tackle in a way that a lot of us have shared values for. The first subcommittee hearing will be on the costs of inaction. The rest we're figuring out, but that's going to be the first meeting, is that it's not about how costly it is to do it. It's about how costly inaction to combating climate change would be. And think natural disasters as the first example, and rising sea changes. This state, we saw with Hurricane Ike, a hurricane that started as a tropical storm at a Category 1, swiftly, within a matter of a little over 24 hours, get to just near Category 5, just close to it, right before it wallowed the Panhandle. And that has billions of dollars in costs. We saw with Hurricane Michael, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how we have our Sheriff, Russell Gibson, here, who did a great job during Hurricane Irma to protect our community. Thank you, Sheriff. Let's give him a round. I'll definitely give you a few minutes to be able to address everybody on this, but I know this is, if we're not paying for it through tackling climate change, we're going to be paying for it through natural disasters. Also through infrastructure. So for instance, during what they call the King's Tide, the highest tides of the year, we have water running through the streets of Miami Beach. And when you have the water table rising, you have oceans rising, and the existing sewage infrastructure doesn't work anymore because it relies on gravity and on water pressure. And as that water rises, it then starts infiltrating, and then salt water has a real devastating effect on the plumbing and the infrastructure for our water. So those are just two effects. Then you look at the wildfires, how much more intense they've been out in California. We had a huge typhoon, one of the second biggest to hit the United States in history in Northern Mariana Islands, and of course Hurricane Maria that devastated my family's native island of Puerto Rico. And then infrastructure and resiliency is another thing we'll be working on. We know that we can't just have wooden telephone poles anymore, and we can't have old 1970s or 80s electrical infrastructure for our grid. We absolutely need to put underground electric wiring and other infrastructure where we can, or at least have cement poles and have resiliency. Those are just some of the things that we can do. I could spend literally the rest of the town hall talking about climate change, but because we have a couple other important topics, I'm going to be readdressing those things with questions that we may have moving forward. A couple things that our office is working on specifically. First, I'm excited. We filed in the first full week a series of environmental bills that I had filed in the last term that we came close on, but we weren't able to get done, that now we will be pushing forward. Last term we were able to pass the Shark and Billfish Protection Act, one of the major laws that I was able to pass, and we passed more laws than any other freshman in the Congress, so I'm pretty excited about that. So hopefully we could double or triple that figure, but these are the bills that and ideas you'll see that we'll directly work on. First is continuing to push to make Kissimmee River a wild and safe river. We spent nearly $1 billion by when it's all said and done to restore the Kissimmee River. A little bit of history, some of you may know this already. The Army Corps of Engineers back in the 1940s made a big canal. They were worried about flood control, which is important, obviously. We need to protect human life. But by the time it was done, it didn't take long for them to realize this was a devastating effect on the environment. And the whole river shriveled up and died, basically, and endangered species and other habitat were injured. But in addition, it basically created a straight shot of nutrient-rich water from Central Florida homes going right down into Lake Okeechobee. So as we talk about some of the inputs in the Lake Okeechobee red tide, this was one of them, and it's still one of them, but it's getting much better. Now, most of the Kissimmee River's done, and it is very winding. So anybody who likes kayaking, my team, a lot of us went kayaking on it, and it's amazing. It's a great ride, and I definitely encourage y'all to do it. If it becomes a wild and scenic river, basically the bill creates a study, Department of Interior makes a recommendation, and then Congress can approve it, or DOI can approve it on its own. But that would limit the type of development that could be on the river. Recreational things compatible with the river are fine, but we don't want, big condos or huge ag facilities that are right on the river and pour nutrients into there. Grazing isn't as big of a deal, but having huge facilities on there or development that's incompatible with it would just add more nutrients to the river. We're trying to clean it up. And that river, as you know, starts in our district, right at the end of the Kissimmee chain of lakes. Another issue that we're dealing with, which is one of the biggest issues, is red tide. We know already, while it's a naturally recurring phenomenon, we are seeing it on steroids explode and not only hurt our way of life as Floridians, but also hurt our marine life and our economy. And there are many things that are adding to it. Agricultural runoff is one of the biggest ones. Fertilizer practices by residents both on the rivers and along the lake. Septic tanks, another big one. And yes, even our semi-treated water from Central Florida that goes through the Kissimmee River, which is why that Kissimmee River piece is an important part of reducing nutrients going into the lake. So one of the positive things that just happened is the Florida legislature 2 years ago bought enough land to create a southern reservoir. And just so a little background on how complex it can be, you have a bunch of competing things that we have to factor in when we're talking about the needs of that region. One, the Everglades need more water flowing down south. There's not enough of it. But we can't have it heavy with phosphate, or else we won't have a sea of grass and marsh anymore. It'll become a big swamp. And there's a federal decree and also CERP, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, that limits all this. So while we need more water going south so that it doesn't go out the Caloosahatchee River or the St. Lucie River and be nutrient rich and create these red tides, when we push it south, it's got to be clean first. So this southern reservoir is an important part of it. In Congress, we have the Water Resource Development Act, which passed the House but did not pass the Senate. That's where $500 million in funding for the southern reservoir is locked up right now. There might have been a little politics on why they didn't let it pass last year. We're going to get beyond that, and hopefully in the first 6 months, we'll see the Senate passing, because I know we're going to queue it back up very quickly. But we need that southern reservoir built. That'll push more water south, so that's less water that goes out the estuaries and creates this nutrient disaster that creates red tide. In addition, there was a decent move by our new governor, which I was surprised about pleasantly, that DeSantis fired the whole South Florida Water Management Board because they were going to lease it for 10 years to Sugar. We clap at that. It's okay. Because after we bought this land, they were going to lease it back to the sugar industry for 10 years, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And they did it in a quickly scripted meeting right at the end of last year, even though you even had Congressman Mass there who had said, you know, this is not supported by the administration. So that's a big start, because we don't want to have any, and that hurt us at the federal level. That's an important piece that may not be fully understood. When the Army Corps is saying we're doing all these projects, and yet you're exacerbating the problem with leases for the next 10 years, that hurt our efforts. So one of the big solutions is passing the Water Resource Development Act and getting the money for that southern reservoir. The second big piece is the Herbert Hoover Dike, and that's where we've already had some success. So the dike surrounds the lake for anybody who's driven around it. The lake has been prone for flooding, and back in the 30s and 40s killed over 2,000 people. If anybody has read the book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, by Laura Neal Hurston. Thank you. Zora Neale Hurston. That's it. They talk about that flood, and so we will be able to store more water in the lake and less discharges once the dam is done. And we're able to speed that up from 2024 to 2022. And if we can dig deep, hopefully we'll be able to do it even quicker. And so those are big parts of it, is sending more water south, Kissimmee River restoration, and holding more water there. And then there's going to be the tougher decisions. Reducing agriculture impact in the region, which is a state, primarily state matter, but there's a federal effort to it. Getting through the $1 trillion infrastructure package we hope to pass along with our state partners, getting most of these communities on sewer and off of septic tanks is another one that's going to hurt. We passed a bill when I was in the state house, and then it was repealed a year later because of huge outcry. But we need to help folks, particularly who have septic tanks from a long time ago, but we need to convert them to sewer. That's going to be another big issue. And then local communities can really help by stepping up and doing fertilizer ordinances. We saw that here in Orange County. Eric Rollins helped champion that. In Osceola, and then Brevard has gotten really serious too. And I want to talk briefly about the brown tide that we saw in the Indian River Review. That, from most accounts, is because of the overdevelopment on the Indian River Lagoon, and so many people who they would fertilize too often during the year, and then lawn waste would be spread in it, and it used to have nice seagrass because it was like the Everglades, a phosphate weak environment. It had very few nutrients, and that's what made it the way it is. Just like that's what makes the Everglades the way it is. And so Brevard ended up working on their property tax issues, and then putting fertilizer ordinance and doing major dredging. But you can see, going back to the cost of inaction, that's exactly it there. A couple other issues that we're working on are dealing with fracking, which I know, again, we're seeing some positive movement in the state where we may see it finally banned Another issue, I see a lot of road warriors who joined me on that initial push back in 2013 and 14. I have two bills that we put forward. One, to codify into law the safety standards for both fracking and offshore drilling that the Obama administration put in place regarding well pressure, and then a second one regarding inspections by independent groups. These are two things that the Obama administration put in place, but that the Trump administration has tried to repeal through a change in the rulemaking process. We want to codify these into law so that we make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep our water safe. With that, I know there's a million other things we can talk about, but I wanted those to happen through questions and have our guest speakers be able to address everybody. And I finished 3 minutes early. I get one time for that. Yes, Brendan, we appreciate it.